Just a few years ago, North Korea was on the brink of collapse. International organizations were flashing red warnings about a mass famine that threatened half the country's population. The economy was basically flatlining, and that massive army, along with millions of rusting artillery shells, looked like a useless financial black hole for one of the poorest nations on Earth. But in 2022, everything flipped. The exact thing that had been bleeding North Korea dry for decades suddenly started minting billions. Over the next 4 years, Pyongyang raked in 4 times more cash than it did in the same period before the war. Suddenly, you're seeing brand new Chinese cars and the latest smartphones hitting the streets of a completely isolated, severely lagging country. So, how did destitute North Korea end up supplying roughly half of the Russian army's frontline ammo? And why on earth did Kim Jong-un deploy thousands of his own troops to fight for Russia? Today we're breaking down how the world's ultimate hermit kingdom managed to hijack someone else's war and turn it into their own economic boom. North Korea actually had a bizarre, almost absurd problem. They actually knew how to physically produce things. They mined mountains of coal and iron ore, smelted steel, and cranked out weapons. The real bottleneck was selling it. Back in the day, the system ran like clockwork. North Korean mines dug up coal and iron. Fishermen exported seafood. Tens of thousands of citizens worked abroad. And China bought almost all of it. To put that scale in perspective, by the mid-2000s, coal exports alone were injecting around $100 million in hard cash into Pyongyang every single month. For a microeconomy that isolated, that is astronomical wealth. But North Korea decided to dump all that revenue straight back into its military complex. After a string of nuclear tests, the UN finally cut off the oxygen. Brutal embargoes slammed shut everything that brought in foreign currency, from coal and lead to fish, locking state banks in a total financial deep freeze. These sanctions didn't bite instantly, but eventually they choked the North Korean economy. After a brief spike in 2016, the country spent 6 years essentially stagnating or spiraling. Just look at this chart. The sanctions sniped the exact industries that used to print Pyongyang's money: coal, ore, metals, seafood, and overseas labor. Then, in 2020, Kim Jong-un pulled off something Western sanctions never could. Paralyzed by the pandemic, he completely sealed the border with China. The country essentially bricked its last window to the outside world. This wasn't just about GDP metrics anymore. Global watchdogs were sounding the alarm on a severe food deficit, with over 10 million North Koreans facing chronic malnutrition. Reports of starvation deaths even started leaking out. By early 2022, Kim's regime was backed into a brutal corner. Traditional cash flow was dead. Trade with China had cratered. The economy had been flat for years, and a massive famine was looming. But right at that absolute rock-bottom moment, a war broke out thousands of miles from the Korean peninsula. And overnight, that war turned North Korea's most economically useless asset, its sprawling ammo dumps and military factories, into a massively in-demand commodity. In the early months of the war, Russia could still lean on its own stockpiles. But the Blitzkrieg plan to take Ukraine failed, and the front line bogged down into hundreds of miles of trenches, bunkers, and minefields. In that kind of war, artillery is king, and burn rates for shells jumped from the thousands into the millions. Russia was caught completely off guard by the sheer scale of it. Domestic defense plants were redlining, running triple shifts and desperately expanding. But let's be real. You can't just 10 times your heavy manufacturing with the snap of a finger. You don't build factories in a month, and the artillery was needed yesterday. Enter the nearly perfect supplier, North Korea. For the last 70 years, this country has been maniacally prepping for an all-out artillery war with the South. Their underground bunkers were stacked with actual mountains of munitions. And the absolute kicker here is compatibility. North Korean artillery is a direct legacy of Soviet engineering. Kim was mass-producing the exact hardware Moscow critically needed, the good old 122 and 152 millimeter calibers. By 2023, Western satellites started picking up major anomalies. A massive logistical pipeline of ships, trains, and thousands of shipping containers started flowing endlessly from North Korean ports straight to the Russian Far East. It became dead obvious. These weren't civilian goods. The scale of this operation is staggering. Think about it. The entire European Union was scraping the bottom of the barrel to piece together 1 million shells over a whole year. Meanwhile, North Korea, a nation crushed by the strictest sanctions on Earth, shipped out several million in just 6 months. Naturally, they burned through their old stockpiles first, but as Russian demand skyrocketed, the North Korean military-industrial complex kicked into maximum overdrive. By February 2024, South Korea's defense minister dropped a highly revealing stat. Due to crippling shortages of power and raw materials, most North Korean arms factories were coasting at around 30% capacity. But the plants churning out shells for Russia, they were running at a full 100%. That single spark was enough to jumpstart North Korea's entire economy. A weapons plant doesn't exist in a vacuum. It needs steel, which wakes up the mines and smelters. It needs explosives, which boots up the chemical sector. It needs logistics, which gets the rail networks and ports moving. It needs expansion, which triggers a construction boom. Every single Russian purchase order sent a chain reaction straight down the North Korean industrial pipeline. From there, the scale started expanding at a frankly obscene rate. Estimates show Pyongyang has handed over millions of artillery rounds, with some modern intel pointing to north of 15 million shells. According to official intelligence data, North Korea is physically covering anywhere from 35% to 50% of the front line's entire artillery needs right now. Let that sink in. The artillery munitions alone are valued at a minimum of $1.5 to $2.5 billion. Factor in the desperate wartime premium Russia was willing to pay for acute deficits, and the total contract value could easily crack $4 billion. Kim figured it out fast. If Moscow is buying ammo in these quantities, it's time to upsell the catalog. First came the ballistic missiles, specifically the KN-23 and KN-24 systems. Analysts track that in 2024 alone, North Korea shipped at least 100 ballistic missiles to Russia. The sticker price on a single KN-23 runs between $1.5 and $3 million. Multiply that by 100, and you're looking at another $150 to $300 million in pure profit. Then, some truly exotic hardware for the region started spawning on the battlefield. First up were the massive 170mm Koksan self-propelled howitzers, M1989. Guns North Korea originally designed with the sole purpose of turning Seoul to ash. Next came giant MLRS setups firing up to 600mm rockets, KN-25, and long-range Bullseye 4 self-propelled anti-tank systems. Pyongyang was basically rolling out its entire heavy armor lineup for sale, but they didn't stop at hardware. By late 2024, North Korea offered Russia a resource you can't just stamp out on an assembly line: their own soldiers. By the fall of 2024, this partnership leveled up. North Korea wasn't just exporting weapons to Russia anymore. They were exporting manpower. It started with roughly 10,000 to 12,000 troops dropping into the Kursk region. Reinforcements followed, bumping the total North Korean footprint to around 15,000 to 22,000 personnel. And this is where we get into some incredibly cynical, yet brilliantly evil, dictator math. Let's run the numbers. According to Global Intel, Russia pays roughly $2,000 a month for every North Korean soldier. For context, 20,000 troops equals $40 million in hard currency hitting Pyongyang's accounts. Every single month. Do the soldiers themselves see this money? Obviously not. All payouts from the Russian MOD bypass the troops and go straight into Pyongyang's state apparatus, and the regime immediately skims 90 to 95% off the top for its shadow accounts. The soldier gets promised $100 to $200 a month at best, and rarely in physical cash. The funds are simply routed into locked domestic accounts in North Korea, theoretically accessible only after they return home. But there's an even darker detail. According to inside sources, Russia pays a compensation fee for every North Korean soldier killed in action, around $30,000. However, based on available data, the state intercepts all of it. NK Insider reports that grieving families only get a food ration, roughly a month's supply of groceries. Ultimately, Kim Jong-un managed to monetize literally every surplus asset North Korea had. First, the rotting ammo jumps, then the factory capacities, then the missiles and heavy armor, and finally, his own workforce and army. And here is where it gets fascinating. What happens when you inject massive external demand into a closed, dying system? Just look at these GDP charts. They look like a glitch. In the 2020 COVID year, North Korea's economy cratered by 4.5%. In 21 and 22, it was pure stagnation and negative growth. Then the picture violently flips. In 2023, GDP rockets up 3.1%. In 24, it hits 3.7%. And in 25, it confidently holds the bar at 3.5%. 3 consecutive years of 3+% growth. For North Korea, these numbers are out of this world. We haven't seen anything like this in the last 20 years.
According to Bloomberg Economics, from 2022 to 2025, North Korea pulled in up to $22 billion in external revenue. In 4 years, Kim bagged the equivalent of what the country would have collected in roughly 16 years at their previous run rate. Obviously, not all of this cash came from Russia. That figure includes rebounding trade with China and massive cryptocurrency heists, something North Korean hackers have practically turned into a masterclass. But the war is undeniably the primary source. Various estimates suggest the military pact with Moscow alone pumped over $10 billion into Pyongyang, while some calculations push closer to $14 billion. To understand that scale, North Korea's entire nominal annual income today sits at just around $34 billion. And this economic boom isn't just trapped in dry reports anymore. It's bleeding onto the streets. Pyongyang has visually transformed beyond recognition in just a few years. Those wide, hauntingly empty boulevards that used to freak out Western tourists now have actual gridlock. Cars are bumper to bumper, with fleets of trucks hauling in Chinese tires and spare parts. New residential blocks are going up. Restaurants and service businesses are opening. Parallel to this, there's a genuine digital boom. The country launched 4G networks for the first time. Not everyone has one, but a growing slice of the population is walking around with personal smartphones. People are hailing cabs from their screens, using digital wallets, and swiping through daily apps. For a nation historically hardwired to total technological isolation, the optics are entirely surreal. But don't rush to be happy for the average Korean. As always, this money doesn't trickle down to the 26 million citizens. All this neon capitalism and the shiny new cars are heavily gatekept by the state elite, military officials, shadow brokers, and the residents of Pyongyang. And Pyongyang is essentially a closed-off VIP server. Drive just outside the capital, and that futuristic facade shatters into abject poverty. It leaves us with a brutal paradox. The war didn't make North Korea a rich country, but it made the regime substantially richer and vastly more powerful. The exact things that looked like a massive economic burden for decades, a bloated army, millions of shells, and a hyper-militarized industry, instantly flipped into the country's most valuable assets. But that leaves one major hanging question. This entire boom is fueled by a war, and eventually, that war will end. When the dust settles, we'll see the truth. Did Kim use this window to structurally transform his economy? Or did North Korea just land a highly lucrative but temporary gig? What do you guys think? Can North Korea sustain this momentum when the war ends? Or will their economic boom dry up the second the Russian money stops? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And to see what's happening to the economy of North Korea's biggest customer right now, check out my previous video on what actually happens to Russia if the war ends tomorrow. Click the video on your screen and subscribe to the channel.